As Reconstruction played out, unfortunately, there was a trend of white supremacy in the South, and eventually the political term referring to the South becomes the Solid South, meaning that they all voted together. And that is the topic of today's presentation. First, there's a bitter taste in the mouths of Southerners when they're divided up into military districts and occupied by Union troops. To make matters worse, carpetbagger is a new term, and it refers to a Northerner who moved south to take advantage of Southern economic and political weaknesses. So businessmen may move south to profit from the Reconstruction process. Another term, scalawag, refers to any Southerner who cooperated with Northerners. You can see a famous cartoon here to the right depicting a carpetbagger, and a photograph on the bottom right of a lynching. The person being lynched in this photo is a white man, so he was probably considered a scalawag. Bitter former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest formed a secret society that terrorized blacks and scalawags, and it became known as the Ku Klux Klan. His goal was to maintain control over society not legally, but through fear and violence. No freed slave and no scalawag would ever dare vote the wrong way, would never dare say the wrong thing in public, or the KKK would probably show up at your house that night. The struggle for power did also include legal challenges to black rights. Black codes were laws passed in Southern state legislatures prohibiting blacks from carrying firearms, starting businesses, appearing in public after sunset, renting or leasing farmland, or even simply traveling without a permit. Here's an example of a black code from Louisiana. No Negro or freedman shall be permitted, which is just allowed, to rent or keep a house within the limits of the town under any circumstances. So a black is not allowed to live within town limits. These are very specific laws targeting very specific rights of blacks. Do not confuse them with Jim Crow laws, which we will go over here in a minute. Sharecropping also maintains control over blacks. Freed slaves could continue to live and work on the plantation where their previous owner had worked them. The price of the rent? Almost everything being produced on the land. So really, they continued the system of slavery. Now, radical Republicans attempted to respond to these trends. The Freedmen's Bureau was created immediately in 1865 to aid former slaves in their transition to freedom. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 gave the federal government the power to protect the rights of blacks. The Force Acts of 1870 and 71 authorized federal troops to break up terrorist groups like the KKK. And another Civil Rights Act in 1875 prohibited businesses from discriminating against blacks. Jim Crow laws, as I mentioned before, slightly different than black codes. Black codes targeted the rights of blacks. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation. A series of Supreme Court cases in 1883 said there was very little the government could do to stop a private business from segregating people. Here is a picture of Martin Luther King Jr., a famous civil rights activist of the 1950s and 60s. He's being arrested for sitting at a lunch counter that was reserved for whites only. More pictures of the civil rights movement. Black college students in the upper left sit at a lunch counter, while, ironically, in the foreground is a black man clearing the dishes from the counter. On the right, on top, you can see where some white students did join black students in the sit-ins at lunch counters. And you can see the response of Southern whites to these protests. Food and drink could be dumped over your head. And the bottom left is a march and a protest against segregated public schools. And in the bottom right, you can see a fire department using power hoses to mow down protesters. Now, there were two ways of thinking in the black community as far as advancing black lives. Booker T. Washington spoke in favor of blacks focusing on achieving economic independence by seeking out an education or vocational training. He said political rights were a lower priority. The first and foremost priority should be earning a living to take care of your family. W.E.B. Du Bois, however, criticized Washington's view. He said he agreed that education and training was very important, but he did not believe that it should be at the expense of civil rights. He encouraged blacks to fight for their political rights as well as their economic rights. On the left is Booker T. Washington, and on the right, W.E.B. Du Bois. The Democratic Party in this time period is the party of slavery, and the party of the KKK, and the party opposing civil rights. Public opinion changes. Northerners begin growing sick and tired of the expense of the military occupation of the South. Protecting free blacks became less of a priority as people's private interests became more important to them. And eventually, the Amnesty Act of 1872 allowed former Confederates to secure their voting rights again. This allows the Democratic Party to gain control of the South once again. Once they do so, they target black voting rights immediately through literacy tests. A freed black would likely not be able to read. Poll taxes. A freed black would likely not be able to pay the slightest of fees to vote. And grandfather clauses. Due to the fact that there were some poor whites who also couldn't read and also couldn't pay a poll tax, anyone whose grandfather was an eligible voter prior to the law's passage, whether it be a poll tax or a literacy test, was still eligible to vote. So this protected the poor uneducated whites' voting rights, while still targeting the voting rights of blacks. The term Solid South, if you look at these maps, refers to the blue colorations throughout the entire South. The South voting together, solidly Democrat, until really the 1960s and 70s. Any freed black that was not legally disenfranchised by Jim Crow was terrorized by the Ku Klux Klan. The Force Acts were ineffective, and most blacks just plain submitted out of fear. And so this is where the term Solid South came from, because the only remaining voters were whites who supported the Democratic Party. Last, but very important, is the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, where the term separate but equal comes from. This is in 1896. It reinforces the Supreme Court decisions of 1883 that supported segregation. The decision said that segregation was acceptable as long as the separate facilities were equal in quality. Unfortunately, the equal part of this decision is never enforced. This is seen here with a white drinking fountain that is cooled by an electric refrigerated fountain, and then the black fountain is just piped off to the side and has no refrigeration. Colored drinking water was often simply a bucket with a spout, as seen on the bottom. This is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you take the online quiz. If you've taken good notes and you use them on the quiz, there's really no reason you can't receive a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.